They said it would take a war to bring down the British crown. They were wrong. It only took a woman, not born into royalty, not polished by tradition. An American divorcee with red lipstick, a steel heart and secrets sharper than any sword. Her name was Wallis Simpson, and she did what no monarch, no rebel, no enemy ever could. She took a king off his throne and erased the woman who came before her like she never existed. Fred Dudley Ward had his love. Wallis Simpson took his soul. If you're drawn to the untold side of history, the forbidden stories that were almost erased, make sure to subscribe to The Untold Woman. It's time to see who really rewrote the rules. The curtains of England's highest courtrooms never saw her coming, neither did the public. When Wallis Simpson arrived on the scene in the 1930s, she wasn't royalty, she wasn't even respectable by British standards, twice divorced, sharp-tongued, American. Everything the crown was supposed to reject, she embodied. But King Edward VIII didn't flinch, because by the time the world caught sight of Wallis, he was already ensnared. She didn't beg for attention, she controlled it. In rooms filled with duchesses and diplomats, she wasn't the loudest voice. She was the most dangerous one, silent, watching, calculating. Before Wallis, there was Fred Dudley Ward, a woman Edward had loved for 16 years. But Freda didn't play chess. She thought she was safe. She thought affection was enough. Wallis didn't want affection. She wanted power, and she knew exactly how to get it. Their love triangle was never written in scandalous letters. It was coded in glances at elite dinners, in missed calls, in sudden silences from Buckingham Palace. Wallis didn't seduce Edward the way the press believed. She did something far more lethal. She made him feel like a king outside of his crown. She questioned everything he was trained to obey. His duty, his role, even his past. And bit by bit, he unraveled. Inside the walls of St. James's Palace, the monarchy began to rot from the inside. Advisors whispered. Parliament panicked. Because they all saw what Edward refused to see. This wasn't set love. This was revolution. A woman was about to upend an empire, with nothing but her reputation. Wallis didn't care about titles. She already had what she wanted, the king's obsession. Behind velvet curtains she erased Freda, not with violence, with silence. Old letters were removed, photos tucked away. History would remember the woman who made a king abdicate, not the one who held his heart for over a decade. And when Edward finally stepped down in 1936, the world was shocked. He gave up the throne. He gave up the Commonwealth. He gave up everything for a woman he wasn't even allowed to marry inside the church. The British people didn't forgive him. They never trusted her. And yet, they were powerless to stop it. Wallis stood by his side, smiling for cameras, stone-faced behind the scenes. The Duchess of Windsor, a title invented to placate her but never fully accepted by the royals. She had no crown, no coronation, but she had conquered. Freda disappeared. No headlines, no documentaries, only echoes. Because history isn't always written by the winners. Sometimes it's written by the woman who burns the pages behind her. Wallis didn't just rewrite her story. She deleted others, and in the flickering shadows of the Windsor lineage, she remains the ghost that still haunts the throne. The palace press team worked overtime, not to protect the monarchy that ship had sailed, but to rewrite the destruction of a dynasty into something palatable, digestible, romantic. They spun it as a love story for the ages. A man who gave up everything for the woman he adored, a crown traded for a kiss, headlines melted over it. Edward chooses love over duty. Wallis Simpson, the American temptress who stole a king's heart, but no one talked about what and who had to be erased first. Her name was Freda Dudley Ward, and she was the first ghost Wallis ever created. For 16 years, Freda had been Edward's companion, longer than most royal marriages. They met during the First World War when Edward was still the young, restless Prince of Wales. Freda was beautiful, married, and sharp. But more importantly, she understood the rules. Be quiet, be private, be loyal, and above all, never threaten the crown. She was his safe place, his escape, and he loved her, deeply, obsessively, in the only way Edward knew how. Their letters, still preserved today, read like the frantic notes of a teenager, not a future king. But it was a love built on discretion. She never appeared in tabloids, never gave interviews, never asked to be anything more than the shadow behind the throne. And then Wallis arrived, louder, bolder, American. She wasn't set royal, she wasn't set quiet. She wasn't interested in playing by Freda's rules. Edward was already drifting from tradition, but Wallis made him dive. She laughed at royal protocol, mocked the palace traditions, called courtiers silly little men. She treated him not like a prince, but like a person, flawed, fragile, hungry to be seen. And he fell for her fast. Too fast. Freda noticed immediately. The visits stopped. The letters became shorter, colder, carefully worded. She was losing him, but no one was saying it aloud. Behind the velvet curtains of Buckingham Palace, Freda watched the life she'd built, the identity she'd maintained, collapse in silence. No confrontation, no goodbye, just absence. A woman erased by another sep's ambition. And Wallis. She didn't just replace Freda. She rewrote the script entirely. To the palace staff, she was an inconvenience. To the Prime Minister, she was a threat. But to Edward, she was oxygen. She gave him something Freda never dared to offer: rebellion. Wallis didn't want to be the secret. She wanted the stage, the headlines, the spotlight. And Edward, the king in waiting, handed it to her with both hands. Freda watched it unfold from the sidelines. She never spoke publicly. She never fought back. Because how do you fight a woman who's not just rewriting history but burning the old pages? Wallis wasn't that subtle. She paraded through royal gatherings with a smile that didn't ask for permission. She dressed for war, tailored suits, bold lipstick, eyes like daggers. Edward started skipping official engagements, stopped responding to Parliament SIP's calls, started hosting intimate dinners where Wallis sat at the head of the table like a queen in waiting. It wasn't just a romance. It was a transformation. Wallis wasn't molding herself into royalty. She was molding royalty around herself. Freda vanished from photographs, vanished from royal archives. Even her letters, once treasured by Edward, were boxed, buried, or forgotten. Because Wallis didn't just win the prince. She demanded he burn the path behind him. And burn it he did. Royal advisors panicked. The Archbishop of Canterbury issued a statement condemning the relationship. The Prime Minister warned of national instability. But Edward had already made up his mind. Not because Wallis was flawless, but because she was the first woman who had dared to tell him no. She mocked him, dismissed him, challenged him. And for a man born into obedience, that felt like freedom. Freda never stood a chance. She was the loyal shadow. Wallis was the storm. And Edward? He followed the storm into exile. When the abdication came, it shocked the world. A king walking away. For a divorced American woman? Unheard of. Freda watched it all from the sidelines, her name never mentioned, her story overwritten by one more passionate love affair, narrative crafted for public consumption. But behind palace doors, no one was smiling. Not Queen Mary, who mourned the son she no longer recognized. Not the courtiers who scrambled to hold the monarchy together, and certainly not the British public who were being asked to romanticize a national crisis. Because the truth wasn't poetic. It was brutal. Edward hadn't sacrificed for love. He had run from duty. And the woman who led him? She didn't want to be loved. She wanted to be legendary. Wallis Simpson wasn't chasing a fairy tale. She was writing a power play. And Freda Dudley Ward? She became the erased draft. The footnote. The memory locked behind a smile the world had chosen to forget. But some ghosts don't vanish. They linger. In the margins. In the archives. In the soft spaces of history that never make the screen. And maybe that sips the real tragedy. Not that Edward left the throne. Not that Wallis won. But that Freda, the one who had loved without scandal, without demand, was buried in silence while the woman who destroyed a kingdom became a headline. This wasn't just a story about love. It was a story about how power rewrites love, and how history always chooses the louder voice. Freda never shouted, and so the world stopped listening. But we haven't set. There were no fairy tale gowns, no glittering coronation, no royal chapel echoing with vows. When Wallis married the former King of England, it wasn't with blessing, it was with exile. The ceremony took place in a borrowed chateau in France. The Duke of Windsor, no longer Edward VIII, stood beside her in a mourning coat. His hair was thinner, his eyes sunken, his crown gone. Yet he looked at her like she had handed him freedom itself, and maybe she had. Wallis wore a pale blue dress famously called Wallis Blue, a color chosen to match her eyes, but her gaze that day was unreadable. She had everything she claimed not to want, a man who defied an empire, a title born from sacrifice, and a world watching in morbid fascination. There were no royals in attendance, no family, not even Edward's mother, Queen Mary, who refused to acknowledge the wedding. For them it wasn't a celebration, it was a scandal cemented in rings and regret. Wallis had won the man, but she would never win the throne. The British government refused to grant her the title of Her Royal Highness, a decision that would haunt them both. And Edward, once a king with a nation at his feet, was reduced to writing angry letters to Parliament, begging for his wife to be recognized. But the real punishment wasn't political, it was personal. They had no home, no court, no country. They drifted through Europe, socialites with nowhere to land. Wallis entertained at high society dinners in Paris. She smiled in front of cameras, dressed like royalty, moved like royalty, but the crown never truly returned. Behind closed doors, things shifted. The passion that had burned in stolen moments and whispered rebellions cooled in the silence of ordinary life. Wallis had never imagined herself as a wife, certainly not the wife of a man who had walked away from everything for her. She resented the weight of it, the isolation, the endless exile. Edward clung to her, desperate to believe it was worth it, that the sacrifice had meaning. But even he could sense the distance growing. Wallis was sharp, witty, and brilliant, but she was also cutting. The devotion Edward once found thrilling now turned suffocating. He sought her approval like a boy to his mother, and Wallis increasingly pulled away. The world whispered that she had never loved him, that it had always been about the game, the danger, the possibility of power, but those whispers missed the real story. Wallis didn't hate Edward. She hated the version of him she had created. She fell in love with a man rebelling against duty, a man daring enough to reject his role. But what she got was a man consumed by that very rejection, a man who never stopped mourning the crown he gave up, who replayed abdication speeches in his head, who asked again and again, "Did I do the right thing?" And Wallis, a woman who had clawed her way into infamy, was suddenly left carrying the emotional burden of an empire's aftermath. Their home in Paris became a museum of nostalgia, portraits of Edward in uniform, letters from his mother, unopened and yellowing, invitations declined. It was a palace without a kingdom, and Wallis, now Duchess of Windsor, walked its halls like a ghost in heels. The press called her the most hated woman in Britain. For decades, she was blamed for the abdication crisis, the destabilization of the monarchy, and the embarrassment it caused the crown. But hatred is a strange kind of power. It means they never looked away, and that's what Wallis had always understood better than anyone else. She knew how to perform, how to lean into myth, how to let people think she was the villain, because villains, at least, are remembered. Meanwhile, Freda Dudley Ward remained in the shadows, her name forgotten, her story untold. The woman who had stood beside Edward for 16 years was now a footnote in biographies, her letters stored in archives, her voice missing from documentaries. But Wallis couldn't escape Freda completely. Not really. Edward would sometimes mention her name, quietly, as if testing the memory. Wallis never responded. But she noticed the flicker in his eye when a certain song played, the way he paused at old photographs before turning them face down. Freda had given Edward comfort, predictability, devotion. Wallis had given him a revolution, and revolutions by nature are loud, but they don't last. The cracks deepened during the Second World War. The Duke and Duchess were stationed in the Bahamas, an exile disguised as diplomacy. The British government didn't trust them. Rumors swirled about Edward's sympathies for Nazi Germany. Letters, meetings, a possible plot to reinstall him as a puppet king. Nothing was proven, but the stain remained. Wallis hated the Bahamas. She called it a third-rate British colony, loathed the climate, despised the people. Edward, meanwhile, drifted further into irrelevance. He played golf, wrote memoirs no one read, held on to the memory of a crown that had never truly fit him. And Wallis watched him fade. She never returned to the spotlight in the way she had imagined. No royal apologies, no grand reconciliation, just aging tabloids and fading headlines. When Queen Elizabeth II eventually rose to power, she refused to invite the Duchess to official events. The rift remained. But even in her bitterness, Wallis understood something the royals never did. Attention was currency, and she had been rich for a long time. She lived until 1986, alone in her Paris home after Edward's death, half deaf, half blind, surrounded by portraits of a man she had simultaneously saved and destroyed. The housekeepers said she rarely spoke, that her meals were silent, that she wandered the rooms like a woman searching for something she'd lost decades ago. Not love, not power, just meaning. Because what do you do when the world you sacrificed everything for forgets you? Wallis Simpson had become the most infamous woman of the 20th century. But infamy, like royalty, comes at a price. And once you stop feeding the myth, it eats you. History may never agree on who she really was. A seductress, a savior, a social climber, a scapegoat. But if you peel back the legend, if you trace the ash trails behind the crown, you'll find a woman who dared to walk into the lion's den and smile. And for a time, the world bowed. There were two Wallises. The woman who sat beside the Duke of Windsor at dinner parties in Paris, poised, jeweled, lips perfectly curved in amusement, and the woman who stared back at herself in the mirror once the guests had gone home, hollowed, restless, unapologetically aware of her own myth and sick of it. The first Wallis understood performance. She excelled at it. She knew what colors flattered her jawline, how to move with grace through a room full of foreign aristocrats who whispered American like it was a disease. She wielded elegance like a weapon, silencing critics not by arguing but by outshining them. She was the woman Time magazine called the most talked about woman in the world. Not loved, not admired, talked about. And that for her was enough. But the second Wallis, the one hidden behind closed curtains and late-night scotch, knew something the world didn't. She hadn't stolen the British throne. The throne had never belonged to Edward to give. Because long before the crown had rested on his brother's head, long before he'd abdicated for the woman I love, Edward had been unraveling. Freda Dudley Ward had seen it first, and she had tried to hold him together with gentle words and quiet loyalty. But Edward needed more than devotion. He needed destruction. And Wallis, well, she had never been good at half measures. When Edward left the throne, Wallis thought she was gaining a partner, a rebel, a man willing to stand against centuries of control. But what she inherited was a wound, an open, festering wound that never closed. The monarchy didn't just exile Edward, it rewrote him. In public, he was now the former king. In private, he was a man wandering through decades of his own regret. And Wallis? She became both nurse and warden, the caretaker of a man who could never return home, and the scapegoat for a nation desperate to forget. The house in Paris echoed with their exile. Guests came and went, dazzled by the chandeliers and silver cutlery, but they rarely stayed long. There was something haunted in the air, like the rooms were holding their breath. Even Wallis's laughter sounded rehearsed, and behind every toast, every twirl of her sapphire necklace, was a quiet, gnawing question. Was it worth it? Because the truth was, Wallis had never wanted to be queen. Not really. She had wanted power, yes, but power on her terms, influence without obligation, fame without sacrifice. The idea of being a royal had thrilled her, but the reality was isolation, scrutiny, and a husband who never stopped comparing her to the crown he gave up. Sometimes, at night, she would hear him talking in his sleep, not to her, to his mother, to his father, to the palace that had raised him like a lamb to slaughter. "Tell them I did it for love," he murmured once. Wallis didn't wake him. She didn't have the heart to say it out loud. He hadn't done it for love. He had done it because he couldn't bear to be told no. Freda had told him no, once, and it nearly broke him. Wallis never did. That was her brilliance, her trap, her curse. She made him feel like the master of his fate, while slowly becoming the author of his exile. And still, for all the pain and politics, Wallis remained a force. Even as they aged, even as Edward's body weakened and his relevance disappeared, she remained stunning. Designers sent her custom gowns. Socialites mimicked her style. Even in her 60s, she appeared on magazine covers. She had created herself so thoroughly that the world forgot who she had been. But time is cruel to icons. In the 1960s, a new generation of royals emerged. Queen Elizabeth II redefined monarchy. Quieter, more dutiful, less scandalous. Princess Margaret offered just enough rebellion to intrigue without burning down the institution. Diana hadn't yet arrived, but the mold had begun forming. Wallis, once the headline, became the cautionary tale. She was no longer the woman who captured a king. She was the woman who ruined one. And Edward, his health declined slowly, then all at once. In 1972, he died in Paris. His final words were not recorded. There were no dramatic farewells, just breath, and then silence. His body was returned to Britain, buried in the royal family's private cemetery. For the first time in decades, he was home. Wallis followed behind the casket, not as a widow to a king, not even as a royal consort, just a woman, aging, alone, dressed in black, staring at a country that had never accepted her and never forgotten her. The funeral was formal, choreographed. Queen Elizabeth met her briefly, a gesture many took as olive branch, others as royal obligation. Wallis nodded, bowed slightly, and said nothing. Her face was unreadable. Her voice, when she did speak to reporters later, was practiced. "He was the love of my life." It was a sentence that echoed through headlines, but no one asked what else she might have loved and lost. After Edward's death, the house grew quieter, the guests fewer, the parties ceased altogether. Wallis's health began to fail. Strokes, memory loss, brittle bones. Her staff changed her clothes, fed her meals, maintained her legend like museum curators polishing a relic. In her final years, she rarely spoke. Letters went unanswered. Photographs stopped. She sat for hours in front of the same window, watching the Paris streets below. Occasionally, someone would call her name. "Duchess?" But she didn't always respond. She was somewhere else, somewhere before all of this. Maybe with her first husband, maybe at the Waldorf Astoria, maybe in the days when being Wallis Simpson meant possibility, not punishment. When she died in 1986, the world barely noticed. No front-page obituaries, no royal acknowledgements. Her funeral was private, her ashes placed beside Edward's in the Windsor royal tomb. A final irony. She was buried among royals, but never allowed to be one. There were no documentaries. Not yet. No Hollywood retellings. Just rumors, gossip, a name that lived longer than the woman who bore it. Wallis Simpson had stolen the throne, they said. But if you peel back the tabloids, the headlines, the fury of a century, you'll find something simpler. She was a woman who refused to be ordinary, who refused to be ruled, and who paid for that refusal every single day. She didn't want your pity. She wanted your attention. And for a time, she had it all. They had called it the Great Renunciation, but for Wallis, it never felt that noble. Edward had given up the crown, yes, but not for love, not entirely. He'd abandoned the throne because it was easier to escape responsibility than face the reality of his weakness. The crown hadn't been taken. It had slipped from his head long before he met Wallis, and now she was wearing the blame like a cursed inheritance. After the abdication, exile was immediate. Britain didn't just close its doors, it erased their names from polite conversation. Invitations vanished. The press turned vicious. Even Edward's own mother, Queen Mary, refused to meet Wallis, not once. Her message was clear: you may have taken my son, but you will never take your place beside him. And yet, in Paris, Wallis turned the cold into performance. They moved into a lavish villa in the Bois de Boulogne, a quiet corner far enough from Versailles and the noise of London. Their home became a strange museum of exile, silver trays with royal crests, portraits of a king who was no longer king, and closets filled with designer gowns for a duchess who could never be queen. To outsiders, it was a fairy tale in ruins. But Wallis, she played the role with precision. She hosted balls, drank champagne, wore Dior before it ever hit London. The Americans idolized her. Europeans whispered her name like a spell. The woman who had made a king kneel. But beneath the diamonds was a woman unraveling. Wallis had always known how to win attention. What she didn't know was how to live in a world that only ever wanted her to remain a headline. The Duke, once daring and wild, began to shrink. He lived in a fog of past glories. He missed England, missed relevance. He walked through their Parisian halls in uniform, medals clinking like ghosts. He spoke of Freda sometimes. Once he muttered her name in his sleep. Wallis never asked questions. She didn't need to. She knew Freda was his before, but she also knew he was never fully hers either. When World War II broke out, the fractures grew deeper. Edward was given a post as governor of the Bahamas, a title more ceremonial than strategic. Churchill had been cautious, even suspicious. There were rumors the Duke had Nazi sympathies, whispers that Hitler believed Wallis might be the key to reinstating Edward to the throne under German rule. Wallis hated the Bahamas. She called it third-rate, boring, a prison in paradise. The heat drained her. The gossip suffocated her. She grew thinner, smoked more, and in private letters she began to use a word she sipped had never dared before: regret. They spent 5 years there. 5 years of public duties, ribbon cuttings, and endless smiles. But it was also 5 years of silence from Buckingham Palace. The royal family had drawn the line. They would never return. When the war ended, so did any illusions. They returned to France, older now, duller around the edges. The Duke's health worsened. Wallis's friends had moved on. The press had turned to newer scandals, fresher faces, and the royal family was flourishing without them. In 1953, Elizabeth II was crowned, a 25-year-old queen with a new era ahead of her. Wallis watched the coronation on television. She wore a brooch Edward had given her, an emerald once owned by Queen Alexandra. As the golden crown was lowered onto Elizabeth's head, Wallis said nothing, but her jaw clenched just enough for the room to notice. It was not jealousy. It was realization. The world had moved on. Wallis's relevance was now historical. She was not a queen, not a villain, not even a proper duchess by royal standards. She was an echo. But echoes, if powerful enough, haunt forever. She leaned into the mythology, posed for magazine shoots, wrote memoirs, carefully edited, of course, She referred to Edward as David, his private name, called him devoted, romantic, unchanged. But readers knew, between the lines, there was something brittle, something undone. In one interview she said, "I am nothing without him." It was framed as love, but others heard something else, despair. Because Wallis had always defined herself by the men around her. Her first husband had taught her survival. Her second, wealth. Edward gave her the world, but took away the possibility of belonging in it. And Freda? Freda had never left the story, not truly. In letters Wallis never sent, she mentioned her. Once she wrote, "They loved you because you were soft. I survived because I was not." She was right. Freda had been adored, then forgotten. Wallis had been loathed, then immortalized. There's a cruel irony to that. The woman who played by the rules was erased. The woman who broke them became legend. And still, Wallis remained human. Behind the couture and controversy, she laughed at vulgar jokes, cried in silence, held Edward's hand when he trembled from old age. She was no longer chasing headlines. She was chasing something quieter, peace. But peace never quite found her. When Edward died in 1972, she collapsed. Publicly, she wore black, spoke of losing her compass, but privately, she stopped speaking altogether. The years that followed were lonely. Wallis suffered a series of strokes. Her memory faded. She stopped recognizing faces. The woman who had once ruled drawing rooms with a single glance now stared blankly at ceilings, whispering to people who weren't there. She died in 1986, age 89. Her funeral was modest by royal standards. Prince Charles attended, not out of affection, but protocol. She was buried next to Edward at Frogmore, beneath a tomb that read, "His Royal Highness the Duke of Windsor, Her Grace the Duchess of Windsor," not Queen, not Princess, just Duchess. A compromise, a punishment, a posthumous reminder. But maybe Wallis wouldn't have minded. Because despite everything, the exile, the hatred, the silence, she won. She made the crown kneel, made a man abandon his destiny, made history remember her name. She had once said, "You can never be too rich or too thin." But perhaps her true motto was simpler, never be forgettable. And she wasn't set. There's a moment in every exile where silence stops being punishment and becomes identity. After Edward's death, Wallis Simpson didn't become a widow. She became a phantom. The Paris villa where they had once hosted kings and millionaires turned into a mausoleum. Chandeliers still glittered, mirrors still gleamed, but the air had thickened, like time had slowed or simply stopped. Servants lowered their voices. Guests no longer came. The house began to rot in elegance. Wallis rarely left her bedroom. There, in the same bed where Edward once whispered endearments and fears, she lay motionless for hours. Letters from old friends went unread. Gifts sent by American fans gathered dust. And yet, her closet was always immaculate. Her jewelry still arranged in velvet drawers. Her gloves still pressed, as if a part of her believed she might need them again. She wouldn't sit. The strokes began subtly. At first she slurred only a few words, then forgot names, then days. The woman who once ruled dinner conversations with acid wit could barely string together a sentence, but worse than the forgetting was what she remembered too clearly. Whispers from the past began haunting the walls. The Duchess would call out, not to Edward, but to long-dead acquaintances, to Frida, to Ernest, to names no one had spoken in decades. Her staff wrote it off as confusion, but in truth, it was her mind replaying unfinished business. Wallis had fought for everything, her place, her power, her version of history. But now, stripped of audiences and applause, her victories echoed hollow. She would murmur things like, "They lied about me," or "I didn't want the crown. I only wanted him to feel strong." It was the most honest she had ever been. For all the glitter, the jewels, the couture, Wallis had not won a life of her choosing. She had survived in one. After the abdication, she had been cast as the seductress who bewitched a weak king. But Wallis knew the truth was more pathetic than poetic. Edward had clung to her not out of passion but fear. Fear of duty, fear of judgment, fear of loneliness. She hadn't stolen the throne had collapsed, and she'd been blamed for standing nearby. In her lucid moments, she would clutch a photograph of Edward, not the regal portraits, but one of him laughing, hair tousled, shirt unbuttoned. He looked like a boy, not a monarch, and that's how she'd always seen him. A boy pretending to be a man who needed someone else to do the hard parts for him. She had done them, and paid. After Edward's burial, Wallis was granted a modest allowance from the Queen. There were formal letters, cold condolences, but never warmth, never forgiveness. They never saw her as one of them. Even in death, Edward had been permitted a royal burial. Wallis was tolerated only because the scandal had long since expired. No one visited her in the last years. Photographers stalked the gates of her estate, hoping for a glimpse, not of a duchess but of decay. When the French government sent a nurse to check on her health, Wallis mistook her for an old maid from Baltimore. She clutched the woman Sip's wrist and said, "Don Sipt, let them write me out." But history had already started writing her down in ink she didn't control. New biographies painted her as manipulative, power-hungry, obsessed with wealth and influence. Others suggested she never even loved Edward, that she had affairs, that she resented giving up her freedom. She couldn't respond. The strokes had robbed her of speech, and even if she could, would they have listened? In her final years, the villa's once opulent gardens withered. Ivy crawled up the marble, birds nested in the eaves. Time gnawed at the estate like a quiet animal. It was poetic in a way. The woman who had once redefined royal scandal vanishing in plain sight among chandeliers and silence. When she finally died in 1986, newspapers were almost surprised. Many assumed she had already passed. The obituary columns dusted off old headlines. The Duchess of Windsor dead at 89. The woman who changed the monarchy. The King Sip's fatal romance. But none of them knew how to say what she had actually been. A woman who broke the rules, yes, but also a woman who was punished not for being dangerous, but for being inconvenient. Wallis had exposed something no monarch ever wanted to admit, that love, real or not, could dismantle empires, and that when the facade cracked, there was no clean story to sell. Her funeral was quiet. The Queen sent flowers. Prince Charles attended, but no one cried. No one stood long at the grave. They buried her beside Edward, side by side in death as in scandal. The plaque was plain, Her Grace the Duchess of Windsor. It was both acknowledgement and denial. She had spent a lifetime being called too much, too ambitious, too cold, too American. But in the end they remembered her with the least powerful title they could get away with. And maybe that was the final irony. She had taken down a king, but she would never be allowed to rise as queen. Even in remembrance, she remained an outsider. But her story didn't die. New generations rediscovered her, not as a villain but a woman ahead of her time. A woman who refused to beg, who refused to apologize for wanting more, for being loud, for being fashionable, for being unafraid. In every headline written about Meghan Markle, echoes of Wallis throbbed beneath the surface. The American outsider, the divorcee, the media target, the threat to the firm. Wallis had walked, so others could crawl through the fire. And in that way, she won something more powerful than a crown. She became a blueprint. Not for monarchy, but for disruption. Wallis used to say that the worst thing in life wasn't being hated. It was being misunderstood. And as the world moved on without her, rewriting her story in ink she never approved, Wallis Simpson became the most misunderstood woman in British royal history. A woman who had once been at the center of the storm, now reduced to a footnote, a symbol, a scandal turned souvenir. But what no one knew was that behind closed doors, she was still fighting. Not for relevance, not for sympathy, but for ownership of her own story. Because for Wallis, the real war had never been against the crown, it was against erasure. She'd learnt early that history had a way of polishing villains until they gleamed like myths and burying women like her in footnotes and shadows. So she began collecting letters, journals, clippings. She hoarded evidence, not to gloat, but to survive. Some nights she would walk through the corridors of her Paris home and whisper aloud the names no one dared mention anymore. Freda, Ernest, David. The names formed a trail of ghosts, tethered to her by threads of scandal and memory. Each one had been rewritten, reframed, forgotten. But she remembered everything, and it hurt. Especially Freda. Because Freda Dudley Ward hadn't just been a predecessor, she'd been a blueprint. A reminder that love alone had never been enough, that loyalty was disposable, that in the world of royals, a woman's worth expired the moment her usefulness did. Wallis never admitted it publicly, but she feared becoming Freda, discarded, erased, replaced. It haunted her, because even though she had won the man, she had not won the love, not entirely. Edward had adored her, yes, but he had also never let go of the romantic ideal Freda had represented. Gentle, obedient, safe. Wallis had been none of those things. She was sharp, unapologetic, daring. She didn't bend. And for a while, Edward had loved her precisely for that, until he didn't start. Until the isolation began eating at them both. After the abdication, their marriage had become a performance. They were cast in a never-ending theatre production for an audience of none. Every dinner party, every public photograph, every carefully worded statement, choreographed to preserve an illusion neither of them truly believed anymore. Behind the scenes, Wallis was exhausted. She would spend hours staring at old photographs of herself, not out of vanity, but curiosity. She wanted to remember who she had been, before the palace, before the headlines, before the burden of carrying a fallen king on her back. There was one photo she returned to often, a black and white image of her in Shanghai, long before Edward, her smile unguarded, her eyes wide. She looked like a woman still discovering the edges of her power. That version of Wallis was gone. And yet, she mourned her. Sometimes, when the house fell quiet and Edward had gone to bed, she would sneak down to the library and reread their old letters, the ones from the early days, full of coded longing, desperate affection, reckless declarations. I can't live without you. You are my strength. With you I am free. But those words belonged to another time, another Edward. The Edward she now lived with had become soft, diminished. A man stripped of purpose, haunted by the crown he had once cast aside. He read old speeches like they were prayers, studied family photographs like maps to a land he'd been banished from. Wallis pitied him, and sometimes resented him, because in saving him, she had sacrificed herself, and the world never forgave her for it. There were no statues of Wallis, no biographies that dared portray her as complex, only caricatures, headlines, half-truths, rumors. They said she was a Nazi sympathizer because she once had tea with a German official. They said she never loved Edward because she flirted at parties. They said she was cold, manipulative, calculating because she refused to cry in public. But none of them saw her at 3 a.m., pressing her forehead against a window pane, whispering her dead mother's name, or carefully wrapping a bracelet Edward had once given her, even after he'd forgotten it existed, or writing unsent letters to people she knew would never write back. They didn't see the loneliness, the discipline, the quiet heartbreak of being a woman who had given up everything, and still been called too much. Even Freda, in the end, had been granted some dignity. She faded into private life, remarried, reclaimed silence. Wallis was never allowed that. She remained a target, a symbol, the American who broke the British throne, the woman who never knew her place. And yet, she had survived. Through ridicule, through exile, through decades of venom disguised as journalism. Because Wallis understood one thing better than any royal ever could, that survival was an act of resistance, that every breath she took in defiance of the narrative was power. She may not have worn a crown, but she had weaponized presence, and that terrified them. As she aged, the press began speculating about her health, about her finances, about whether she regretted it all. But Wallis never gave them the satisfaction. She didn't grant interviews, didn't explain herself. She let the silence sharpen around her like a knife. Because if they wouldn't tell the truth, she would deny them a lie. And in that silence, she wrote her own ending. Not with a grand speech, not with a tabloid exclusive, but with a final act of defiance. She willed that her possessions, the gowns, the jewels, the letters, be auctioned after her death, not to museums, but to strangers, so that no single institution could own her story, so that no single version could prevail. The Crown wanted her erased. Wallis made sure they'd never stop searching for her instead. The grand halls of Buckingham had begun to echo with something strange: silence. A kind of uneasy stillness that settled not just in the velvet-draped rooms, but in the conversations of courtiers, the lines of the newspapers, the hearts of an empire, unsure whether it was witnessing a love story or the slow unraveling of a dynasty. Wallis Simpson had become more than a name. She was a force. The newspapers couldn't stop printing her. Society couldn't stop whispering about her. But behind the facade of scandal and style, something deeper was happening, something irreversible. Edward VIII, once the Golden Prince, the war hero, the man groomed from birth to wear a crown, had begun to fade, not in power, but in identity. Each decision he made for Wallis wasn't just personal. It chipped away at the very image of monarchy. Tradition was supposed to stand above emotion, but now emotion sat at the throne's edge, wearing a cocktail dress and holding a cigarette holder. His advisors begged him to see reason. "You can have her, sir, but not as queen." They offered him loopholes, legal gymnastics, secret arrangements, anything to keep the throne stable, anything to keep the American from becoming sovereign by association. But Edward didn't want a mistress, he wanted a wife. And so, quietly, the machine began moving. Government officials drafted plans. Parliament rumbled with fury. The prime ministers of the dominions, Canada, Australia, South Africa, all signaled resistance. The monarchy wasn't just British, it was global, and Wallis wasn't welcome on that stage. But to Edward, it was simple: if he couldn't marry her as king, he wouldn't be king. And that was when the throne trembled. December 10th, 1936. In a palace room dimmed by winter light and heavy with the scent of leather-bound law books, Edward signed the instrument of abdication. His hand didn't shake. His voice, when he read the words aloud, was clear. "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility without the help and support of the woman I love." The next morning, the headlines stretched across front pages worldwide. "The king who quit for love." But was it love, or obsession, or rebellion wrapped in romance? The public was divided. Some were enchanted by the fairy tale, the man who gave up an empire for a woman. Others were appalled. The monarchy was supposed to be sacred, unshakable. He'd made it human, messy, fallible. Wallis, now in France, read the headlines with a forced smile. Her divorce had just been finalized. The timing was perfect, and yet, behind the triumph, she knew what was coming. The British establishment would never forgive her. She hadn't just taken their king, she'd forced them to rewrite history. When Edward boarded the train for exile, heading to Austria, then France, then Portugal, he did so as the Duke of Windsor, a title hastily created to give him something, anything to hold on to. But he had no crown, no power, no country. Just Wallis. And she was terrified, because she hadn't asked for this. Wallis had wanted influence, certainly. Prestige, yes. But a king in exile, a kingdom surrendered. She was now the most hated woman in Britain, no longer a socialite, no longer just a scandal, but a symbol, a wound. When they finally married, in a modest chateau in France, no royal family member attended. The Church of England refused to bless the union. There were no trumpets, no balcony kiss, only the sound of camera shutters and protesters outside. She wore blue, not white. Not because of tradition, but because tradition had rejected her. She became Her Grace, the Duchess of Windsor, a title elegant on paper, but heavy with irony, because no grace would be given. Inside their new homes in France, then the Bahamas, then back in Paris, the couple played host to socialites, exiled royalty, American diplomats, but nothing ever matched the shine of what they'd left behind. And slowly, it began to curdle. Edward, stripped of duty, began to wither. He wrote bitter letters to his brother, now King George VI. He missed the ritual, the purpose. He tried to reclaim relevance, flirted with diplomacy, meddled in politics, but doors stayed closed. Wallis tried to keep the illusion alive. She hosted dinners, wrote thank-you notes to every tabloid that softened her image, but she knew she would never be queen, and in some ways she would never even be forgiven. The British royal family made it clear: no return, no red carpet, no reconciliation. Years passed, then decades, and Wallis became a kind of living myth, the woman who broke the crown, the American who rewrote centuries of British history in one whirlwind of charm, ambition, and defiance. She had erased Frater Dudley Ward, yes, but in doing so, she had erased herself too. Because she had traded visibility for vilification, every word she spoke was dissected. Every smile, every gown, every photograph, proof of manipulation or guilt. She couldn't win. Edward, for all his passion, had made his choice, but it was Wallis who bore the consequences. In exile, in whispers, in the footnotes of royal history books that refused to use her name without venom. And yet, she endured. She wrote memoirs, elegant, guarded. She told her story with poise, if not with full honesty. She smiled in public. She leaned into fashion, into art, into being the Duchess they couldn't ignore. But privately, the weight never lifted. She had loved him, yes. But had he loved her, or had he loved the fantasy of what she represented? Freedom, rebellion, escape from royal suffocation? In their final years, the glamour faded. Edward's health declined. Wallis, once the life of the party, retreated into silence. The world had changed. Diana had arrived. A new kind of royal scandal was unfolding, one more telegenic, more tragic, more sympathetic. And Wallis, she became an antique. When Edward died in 1972, he was buried in the royal burial ground in Windsor, a final quiet concession from the crown. And when Wallis died in 1986, they buried her beside him, but not in the royal vaults, in a patch of earth, separate from the true sovereigns. Even in death, she remained outside. But here sits the thing history often forgets. She did what she wanted. She made choices, bold, imperfect, unapologetic. She refused to be quiet, refused to be a side note, refused to stay in her place. She stole a king. She shook an empire. And whether you see her as a villain or a visionary, she made you choose. Because Wallis Simpson was never neutral. She was a storm in a tiara. And as the cameras flash on new royals, new headlines, new exiles and scandals, somewhere, in a Parisian shadow, her ghost still smirks. Because she did it first. And she did it loud. They called her a temptress, a gold digger, a social climber. But by the 1960s, Wallis Simpson had become something far more complicated, a relic of a decision no one dared make again. In the quiet corridors of Kensington and Clarence House, her name was spoken like a warning, a lesson. Royals told their daughters to watch their tongues, told their sons to watch their hearts. Because once, just once, a king fell in love and fell off the throne. And Wallis was the reason why. But if Wallis Simpson thought time would soften the blow, it didn't. For decades she lived in a beautiful cage. Paris became her kingdom, a glamorous exile laced with Chanel gowns and Cartier jewels, where she played hostess to ambassadors and aristocrats. But no matter how dazzling the dinner parties, she always sensed the chill, not from the air but from the lineage she had disrupted. Every time a British newspaper wrote about the Windsors, it was clear she was not one of them. Not truly, not ever. They never invited her to royal weddings, never let her step foot in Buckingham Palace again, and when she tried to send letters to Queen Elizabeth, to her own in-laws, they were often returned unopened. Edward tried to shield her, but he was shrinking, a former king without a cause. He walked like a man who'd given up too much and received too little in return. He read the papers more than he should. He drank. He smiled less. Wallis, meanwhile, continued to wear her mask. Always polished, always poised, but behind the perfect hair and the couture dresses was exhaustion. It was one thing to defy the monarchy. It was another to live in its shadow, forever cast as the villain. Even the public, over time, began to shift. The myth of the romantic sacrifice grew old. New generations didn't remember the abdication. They just remembered a woman the palace refused to acknowledge, and curiosity turned to skepticism, then suspicion. Was it really love or manipulation? Did she lure a king away from duty, or did she save him from a role he was never meant to play? The answers were buried in thousands of pages, press clippings, biographies, memoirs, but Wallis herself never truly clarified. She understood the power of mystery. She once said in an interview, "I'm nothing like they say I am, but why ruin their fun?" Still, she wasn't immune to the loneliness. By the 1970s, their world had shrunk. Edward's health was declining rapidly. The man who had once charmed nations now needed assistance to get through a single dinner party. The sparkle was fading, and Wallis, for all her strength, had no map for this part. They had built their identity on rebellion, glamour, defiance. But what do you become when the world stops watching, when the parties end, when the only audience is the echo of your own choices? When Edward passed away in 1972, something broke inside her. The British government, in a rare act of symbolic mercy, allowed his body to be buried near the royal family at Frogmore. But Wallis, she had to beg for the same. The Queen, Elizabeth II, eventually relented, but not warmly, not publicly. The gesture was administrative, not affectionate. And so, Wallis stood beside his casket, draped in black, as cameras flashed. She didn't cry. She rarely did in public. But those who were there say her hand trembled once, just once, when they lowered him into the ground. Back in Paris, the loneliness settled in like dust. The guests stopped visiting. The calls slowed. She began to forget things, names, faces, events, and then even herself. By the 1980s, Wallis Simpson was alive, but no longer living. Her staff cared for her as best they could, but dementia had arrived like a quiet storm, stripping her memory of scandal, of style, of sparkle. All that remained were flickers, a voice she didn't recognize calling her name, photographs that felt like fiction. The woman who had once shaken an empire now couldn't remember why anyone hated her, and maybe that was mercy. When she died in 1986, the press dusted off the same words they had used for decades: infamous, controversial, divisive. But they had missed something. Wallis wasn't just the American who took a king. She was the woman who exposed how fragile the crown could be. She made the monarchy bleed, not through war but through choice. She forced the royal family to reckon with something they spent centuries avoiding. What happens when duty and love collide? What happens when the fairy tale ends in exile? What happens when a woman refuses to apologize? For the palace, Wallis was a threat because she reminded them of their humanity, their flaws, their limits. And for that, she was never forgiven. But maybe, just maybe, she never asked to be. Because the tragedy of Wallis Simpson wasn't that she was hated. It was that she was right. The system was broken, the role was cruel, the performance was exhausting. She had seen the mask and ripped it off. And in doing so, she left behind more than scandal. She left behind a question, one that echoes through palaces and tabloids and tea tables to this day. What is the cost of being yourself when the world demands a performance? And would you pay it? Because she did. Wallis Simpson paid it in whispers, in exile, in a lifetime of half-forgiven sins. But in the silence of history, she still speaks. They buried her next to the man who gave up everything for her. Not inside the castle, not beside queens or crowned heirs, but at the edge, Frogmore, the royal graveyard reserved for those both remembered and forgotten. The headlines were subdued. The ceremony was small. There were no trumpets, no grand processions. The monarchy had decided Wallis Simpson was to exit history as she had entered it, with scandal and silence stitched into her name. But what they couldn't set control was memory. Even in death, Wallis left a shadow that no coronation could cleanse. Because she wasn't just a footnote in royal history. She was the disruption that revealed the cracks in the throne. The woman who made the crown tremble, not with a war but with a kiss. And yet, she was still human. Behind the headlines and hysteria, behind the Cartier brooches and tailored gowns, was a woman who learned to survive in a world that was never built for her. Wallis was born into a life where women were told to smile, not speak. To marry well, not live freely. To play their part, not write the script. But she refused. She wasn't noble by birth. She wasn't rich. She wasn't even considered beautiful by the standards of her time. But what she had was something far more dangerous. Charisma, control, and an instinct for power that even kings couldn't resist. When the Duke of Windsor fell in love with her, the world gasped. And Wallis didn't flinch. She knew what she wanted. And more importantly, she knew what she would never accept again. Obedience. They said she seduced a monarch. They said she destroyed a dynasty. But maybe all she did was hold up a mirror. To a system so rigid it could not bend, only break. To a monarchy that worshipped appearance, but feared authenticity. To a society that adored fairy tales, but punished real women for trying to live them. Wallis Simpson lived for nearly a century, but she died 100 deaths in the tabloids. Each photo was a sentence. Each headline a judgment. Each royal silence a dagger. And still, she endured. In the final years, when her voice faded and the world forgot, her name never left the royal corridors. Whispered, warned, weaponized. A cautionary tale wrapped in pearls and exile. And Freda Dudley Ward? She was the ghost left behind in the first act. The woman Edward loved before the world was watching. Before Abdication. Before infamy. Before Wallis. Freda had been softer, safer, easier. But she wasn't set Wallis. She didn't make the king choose. Wallis did. That was her power and her curse. She forced a man to decide between the crown and the woman who wouldn't kneel. And when he chose her, the empire cracked. Not enough to collapse, but enough to shake, enough to remember. Because long before Diana, before Meghan, before any royal dared to walk away, there was Wallis, the woman who didn't just leave. She made the king follow, and for that, the palace never forgave her. But maybe the story isn't set hers alone anymore. Maybe it belongs to every woman who has been called too much or not enough. Every woman told to stay silent, to sit still, to smile through it. Maybe Wallis didn't steal a throne. Maybe she shattered a myth. And maybe she never wanted to be a queen. Just a woman, free, unafraid, unapologetic. And for one brief, blinding moment, she was all three. Her legacy isn't carved into stone. It lives in questions. What if love isn't set weakness? What if rules were meant to be rewritten? What if the greatest rebellion is simply to be yourself? Because in a world that tried to erase her, Wallis wrote her name in ink that would never fade. She may not have worn the crown, but she made history bow. If this story made you feel something, a spark, a question, a chill, don't let it fade. Hit subscribe right now, because history isn't just about kings and wars. It's stats about the women they tried to forget. Share this video with someone who needs to hear the untold. Comment below, do you think love is worth the crown? And stay tuned because the next chapter in the Gilded Age of Untold Women is coming soon.